perhaps the Hebrew title found in chapter 1 and verse 1 better fits this book. You see that phrase in the first verse of Numbers, in the wilderness. We get the title Numbers from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But here the Hebrew title, in the wilderness. Moses, again, is the main human character as well as the author of the book of Numbers. Short recap to show where we are in Israel's story up to this point. You see and remember that Genesis begins with creation and then focuses on the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as they grow Israel into a people. And then you see they move to Egypt because of famine. In Genesis, if you remember chapter 12, God enters into a covenant with Abraham and for the first time announces his promise to bring Israel to the promised land, a land that flows with milk and honey, a land which would be in Numbers today occupied by the people of Canaan. Exodus then transitions to tell how Israel left Egypt and came to Mount Sinai to receive the law. Then Leviticus contains much of this law giving at Mount Sinai, and so does the book of Numbers. But Numbers then more specifically scattered all throughout the book describes Israel's travel from Mount Sinai all the way up to the edge of the promised land. Main idea of the book, Numbers clearly displays God's gracious presence with Israel. Despite their repeated disobedience, disobey and complain over and over again, God is very visibly present with them by fire at night, by the cloud in the day, and he graciously provides for them. And we see, despite their great and repeated sinfulness, Israel is poised to finally enter the promised land by the end of this book. Here we get to our outline and the key themes, and I'll warn you, it is really, really repetitive. But I ask that you hang tight to the end for some application. I try to make an effort to apply it to us today, and the repetitive nature of this book, I think, serves for a great purpose for us. See it broken into 5 key themes in our outline here. Times of travel and times of stay in the encampment with the tabernacle. Starting here with the first of these, God's people Israel are at Mount Sinai, where they were at the end of Exodus and all throughout the book of Leviticus. Here they still are. Chapters 1 through 10. The first 4 chapters of Numbers, you see here in verse 1, we'll read the first verse of Numbers. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting, if you remember that from last week, on the first day of the 2nd month, in the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel. Here you have the reason for the title Numbers. Chapters 1 through 4, Moses leads Israel and takes a census of the number of all the people. And in this, you see God's faithfulness. Some argue the numbers listed here in these chapters are literal. Some argue they are not. What I would argue is that they are really big numbers. And you remember we started with just Abraham, and God said, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars. And here, God has been faithful to fulfill that promise. Also in chapters 1 through 4, you have God giving instructions for the arrangement of the camp of Israel with its 12 tribes, with the tabernacle at the center. Chapters 5 through 10 then go through laws about ritual purity. If you remember, God wants to be worshipped, yes, but he also cares about being worshipped in purity, how he is worshipped. Chapter 10, then, Israel moves to travel, making their long trek to the promised land. Look at Numbers chapter 9 with me, if you will. You may wonder what caused Israel to travel. When did they travel? How did they know how and when and where to go? Numbers chapter 9, verses 15 through 18 summarize this answer. Short answer, they followed the presence of God. But look at these verses. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. So a cloud covered the tabernacle, and at evening it was over the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until morning. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, after that the people of Israel set out, and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the people of Israel camped. At the command of the Lord, the people of Israel set out, and at the command of the Lord, they camped. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. There you have short summary, which you'll see reiterated throughout the book of Numbers of how Israel traveled, followed God's presence. Here we get to the repetition of Numbers and the problem of Numbers. Chapter 11, God's people complain. Verse 1 of chapter 11, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. The people complain. We know very practically complaining often does no good. Not a good thing to complain, but I'll say it's a much scarier thing when God takes note of our complaining. It says they complained in the hearing of the Lord, and he heard it. And you see his reaction was not one of approval. Verses 4 and 5 continue in chapter 11. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." Not only do they complain, but they look back to when they were slaves in Egypt, sort of spitting in God's face, who had delivered them out, and say, "Oh, that we were back in Egypt," is their complaint, where they had food and water and all that they want. You'll see here that God, even in this chapter 11, we won't read it, but he drops bread from the sky for Israel. And they're wanting better food, or food in a better way, or in the way that they want it. They are complaining while God is providing for them and delivering them out of slavery. Not only do God's people complain, but chapter 12 and verse 1, Miriam and Aaron also complain. This is Moses' brother and sister. You see an element here throughout Numbers 2 of Moses. This is very stressful for him. Leading, shepherding these complaining people. He continually intercedes on their behalf for God. Please forgive them. I know they're complaining. Please forgive them. Here, his own brother and sister publicly complain about Moses. Verse 1 of chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Here you have Miriam and Aaron's complaint. I would probably argue that it's much deeper than just who he married. But the Cushite woman here could be Zipporah. I was reading today, probably not. Which, obviously, he should not have more than one wife. But that's a conversation for another day. And getting to the heart of their complaint, though, here, the Cushites were from Ethiopia. Likely she was of a darker complected skin. And likely this was Miriam and Aaron's complaint of Moses marrying a woman who looked so differently than them and him. And you see God's opinion or thought on the complaint in verse 10 of chapter 12. Miriam was leprous like snow. God did not approve of their complaints, but in fact punished Miriam, sending her this leprosy skin disease. Chapter 13, if you'll continue to turn with me. The people have settled once more in the wilderness of Paran. And verses 1 and 2 of chapter 13, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. Key words, God says, which I am giving to you. So they've approached the edge of the promised land here. And God says, send spies. And Moses sends spies to check out the land, the produce, the fruit, all that is there, to see what they need to learn about the land, doing their due diligence before going and trying to take over the people of Canaan. The spies come back and they say, the land looks great. Except that the Canaanites are very strong and we are fearful of them. We do not need to enter this land. But remember, God said, I'm giving you this land. Remember God's covenant with Israel. You will be my treasured people. You will conquer nations and peoples who are much bigger than you, if only you will stay with me and in my presence. The spies come back and they say, we do not need to mess with the Canaanites. We need to stay far away. They will destroy us. What they're not doing is trusting God's promise to them. This is their land. They will take it. They will survive. Here you have rebellion. Chapter 14, there are spies who say we need to stay away. There are some faithful spies, Caleb and Joshua, I believe, who say, no, God promised this and we need to go take it. There are people who say we need to go back to Egypt. And there are people that say we want to die right here in the wilderness. So that sounded chaotic. That is chapter 14 of Numbers and the few surrounding chapters. Look at chapter 14, verse 33. This summarizes God's punishment of Israel in the midst of all the chaos and complaining. And your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lie in the wilderness. Basically, he sentences them, as you have probably heard, to 40 years of wilderness wandering. And the reason for that 40 years is so that this adult generation, those complaining, those rebelling, have all died and passed. You don't get my promise. You don't deserve it, and you're not going to get it. When you all die, after 40 years of suffering and wandering in the wilderness, your children will get it, the promised land. Chapter 14 and verse 33 summarizes that punishment. That's not all, though. Rebellion of Korah. Chapters 16 and 17, this man named Korah raises up a group of men who rebel against Moses and Aaron's leadership. In chapter 17, God makes clear that Moses and Aaron are to be the leaders of Israel, to the point that people were fearful under the holy presence of God, those who led this rebellion. Chapter 20, God's people then move to travel again. And God's people move to complain again. Chapter 20 and verse 2, now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And there they go complaining again. In the midst of their complaints, look at God's grace again. If people were complaining to me like this, I would say, get away from me, I'm done with you. God speaks to Moses. He says, verse 8, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron, your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. He says, take your staff and command the rock to yield water, and I will miraculously provide water for the complaining people who want this water. Verse 10, then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Moses says, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. Here you have Moses disobeying God, who said, this is very particular, I know, but God said, tell the rock. And the problem is Moses is frustrated with the people, and he acts out of that frustration and screams at them, you rebels, and strikes the rock. Remarkably, God graciously flows water out of the rock for the people to drink freely from. Remember this rock, it's important. Moses is then punished. Chapter 20, verses 12 and 13, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given you. Moses' punishment, now he will not enter the promised land. He will see it, but he will not enter. Chapter 21, guess what happens again? God's people complain. Verses 4 and 5, the people spoke out against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? God then sends fiery serpents which bit the people of Israel so that many of them died. Remember the repetition? They're complaining again. God punishes them, but yet God graciously provides a way for them to be saved from these fiery serpents. Verse 8 of 21, the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent, set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent. He set it on a pole, and if the serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. So just with their complaints with the rock, God provided for them water freely amidst all the sin. Their complaints here, God sends fiery serpents, but he even provides for them salvation from the death from being bitten by these snakes. If only they will look at this bronze serpent that Moses holds up on his staff. These two connect us to Jesus. You look at New Testament writers, they'll even look back into Numbers and Old Testament and make connections to Jesus, but you can see the connection very plainly. If we, like the people with the bronze serpent, would only look to Jesus by faith, our sins will be remedied and forgiven. And with the rock, as Moses struck the rock unjustly, he shouldn't have done it. Out of that injustice flowed water for all to drink freely. Jesus, one of the greatest, or the greatest injustice to ever happen in the world, was that rock who was struck, who was crucified. But out of that injustice comes the waters of salvation that we all freely drink from if we only look to him by faith. So you see allusions even to Jesus in this book. And here is the last of them, or at least another of them. People settle their travels. Chapter 22, at the plains of Moab. Keep turning to chapter 24, if you will. Here we have a man named Balaam. He is a seer, some sort of a prophet. Probably not a man of faith, but he does have some sort of prophetic power somehow. And the king of Moab, his name was Balak. He hired Balaam. If you remember the story of Balaam and the talking donkey, that's this Balaam. This Balak, the king of Moab, hired Balaam to come and pronounce curses on Israel. The king of Moab knew that Israel was going to overtake him. It was just a matter of time, and he hires this powerful man, Balaam, to curse them, destroy them, use all your powers on them, whatever it takes. You see multiple oracles of Balaam through chapters 22, chapter 24, where he, in some sort of prophetic fashion, looks over the people of Israel, prepared to curse them, but he can only see the great goodness and the power, the protection and the provision of God over these people. So each of these oracles, Balaam, rather than curses Israel, he blesses them. That's to Balak's, the king of Moab's, great frustration. This is also remarkable. As the people of Israel are down in the camp complaining about God, God is protecting them from this prophet on the mountain who is being paid to curse them. Look at the last of these oracles of Balaam. Chapter 24, verses 15 through 19, you get another fairly clear reference to Jesus. He took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down with his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. Here it is. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemy, shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly. And one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of the cities. This verse 17, star, scepter, which will rise out of Jacob and Israel, ultimately finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Chapters 26 through 36, then another census is taking, a numbering of the people, rehashing of God's law to the people, up to its conclusion, where God's people are on the edge of the promised land. The 40 years have passed. All of the disobedient, complaining people have passed away. The next generation is now ready, preparing to enter the promised land here at the end of the book of Numbers. It is at this point that Moses, you see in your conclusion there, must have begun to prepare his final words of wisdom and warning to Israel. This points us ahead to the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses recounts all that has taken place up to this point and charges God's people to keep from sin and to follow him in his last sort of speech, preaching to the people. This points ahead to the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is the conclusion of the Pentateuch and the law of God to his people. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6, Paul, you don't have to turn there, we'll conclude here, but Paul looks back to this account and the law, and specifically this book of Numbers, and here's what he says. He says, these were written so that we can learn from the mistakes of our fathers. I think the mistake of the fathers of Israel here in Numbers are failing to remember the blessings and provisions of God in the past, and that allowing them to sin and complain and distrust God to do the same in the future. Paul says this was written so that you learn from the mistakes of our fathers. And I think that's an appropriate reminder for us to understand, yes, the book of Numbers points to Jesus, but we can also find practical help and encouragement to learn from the mistakes of our fathers, not to be a complaining, sinful people who don't trust God, but to trust him, to look back at all the blessings he's given us in the past and trust that he will do the same. And the best of all, just continue to be with us as he is. That's the book of Numbers. We'll move to pray this word.